In the previous video, we explored the concept of geopolitics and how the major European powers were shaping global politics. From 1648 to the early 1910s, even up until World War I, it was widely believed that these dominant powers dictated the course of world events. But what about the rest? How can this perspective be justified? Let's examine the logic. Consider Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal. Weren't these the nations that established colonies across the globe? This was the structure of world. Europe was at the center, influencing regions far and wide. Africa, for instance, was heavily colonized by European nations. The Americas, including Canada and the United States, were once European colonies. Similarly, in South America, the dominance of Spanish and Portuguese languages reflects the colonial past of these regions, such as Brazil. The same European powers extended their influence to Asia and Southeast Asia, creating colonies and asserting control over vast territories. In essence, these powers occupied and shaped entire regions. Even the wars fought between these European powers had global implications, affecting colonies in Africa, the Americas, and Asia. This interconnectedness is why American history, for example, contains conflicts rooted in European disputes. Do you follow what I'm saying? For instance, in India, the French and the British were engaged in conflict, but their clashes weren't just about local rivalries. Those conflicts were influenced by broader dynamics. The power struggles happening elsewhere had ripple effects over here. For example, the gifting of Bombay can be understood as a consequence of how the global equations between European powers shaped local outcomes. This is why it is often said that international relations and politics at their core were essentially about the rivalries among European powers. Now, you might wonder how this concept translates to the broader context. This is where the idea of the balance of power comes into play. Arnold Wolfers illustrated this concept using the billiard ball model. Let me break it down for you. Imagine a game of billiards or pool where balls of different colors are on the table. Each ball represents a nation. When the game starts, these balls collide with one another. Is there a guarantee which ball will hit another? No, there is no certainty. Similarly, in global politics, no nation has a permanent ally or a permanent enemy. Wolfers went on to explain that these hard-shell nations, like billiard balls, are in constant motion, capable of colliding with any other nation at any time. This lack of permanence highlights the fluid and unpredictable nature of international relations, where alliances and rivalries are ever changing. The concept of the balance of power suggests that if one country becomes significantly more powerful, other nations will combine their strength to counter it, as everyone seeks stability. This principle assumes that stability can be achieved through this balancing mechanism. How does this work? Let us revisit the billiard ball model. In billiards, when a ball is struck, it can collide with multiple other balls. Similarly, nations like European powers may clash with one another based on their interests. Which ball collides with another depends on the force of the strike, essentially the dynamics of power. This illustrates that global politics revolves around managing power. Power management happens in primarily two main ways. The first is the external balancing, and the second is the internal balancing. External balancing involves forming alliances with other nations to collectively counter a powerful adversary. For instance, NATO members work together as allies, ready to defend each other when needed. Whereas internal balancing occurs when a country strengthens its own capabilities, economically, militarily, or otherwise. to counter a potential threat. For example, if Britain or France became too powerful, other countries would feel threatened and form alliances to check their dominance. The concept assumes that no nation wants another to become so dominant that it undermines their own interests. The balance of power ensures that if one nation grows excessively powerful, others will unite to restore equilibrium. They may warn the dominant nation to restrain itself, and if it refuses, they could resort to war. This mechanism, as the billiard ball model illustrates, helps maintain regional and global stability by preventing any single power from becoming overwhelmingly dominant. This concept is still relevant today. For instance, to counter China's rising influence, countries are strengthening their defense and economies internally, while simultaneously building partnerships with other powerful nations. The balance of power in both internal and external forms continues to shape international relations. From 1648, international politics began to operate on the concept of the balance of power, which was believed to bring peace and stability. This idea remained dominant from 1648 until 1919, though between 1914 and 1918, the world experienced the devastation of World War I. The war originated in Europe, demonstrated that the balance of power concept has failed. Instead of ensuring peace and stability, it led to massive destruction. The logic behind this approach was discredited, and when one idea fails, a new one emerges. In 1919, a new vision for peace was proposed by the then US President Woodrow Wilson. In a famous speech, he outlined a path forward, advocating for the creation of the League of Nations, a precursor to today's United Nations. The League of Nations aimed to promote peace through the principles of liberal institutionalism. However, the League, like its predecessor concepts, ultimately failed, as its story reveals. Friends, what is liberal institutionalism? Don't worry, I'll explain. Until then, international politics or geopolitics was largely interpreted through the lens of realism. Realist thinkers dating back to ancient times argued that the core characteristics of global politics is conflict. They believed war was inevitable and that power was the ultimate currency of international relations. According to realism, global politics was inherently about the struggle for power and dominance. The League of Nations represented a shift from this realist perspective to a more cooperative and institutional approach, aiming to change the nature of international politics. Realism suggests that international politics lacks any guiding principles. It is purely about power. Those who are more powerful dictate outcomes. In essence, it adheres to the idea that might makes right. If you possess the power, you can act as you wish, and your actions will be deemed acceptable. For instance, this mindset is evident even today. Take the example of the United States of America's invasion in Iraq. Despite the United Nations Security Council advising against it, the USA proceeded with the invasion because it had the power to do so. They went ahead regardless. When they decided to enter Afghanistan, they did so. When they chose to intervene in Libya, they took over. Their justification was removing a dictator, but the consequences included the deaths of countless civilians. Was there any overarching principle governing human rights or international norms? No. The idea of might is right prevailed. Countries act based on what they deem necessary for their own interests. If they have the power, others depend on them. And because of that dependency, those nations maintain ties with them, regardless of the actions taken. This is the reality of international politics, and it continues to hold true even today. Back then, this approach was considered the norm. To understand it better, let me explain through an example. Scholars who support this view often refer ancient thinkers like Thucydides. He introduced the concept now known as the Thucydides trap. The Thucydides trap refers to a scenario where nations are caught in a cycle of insecurity. Thucydides observed that in ancient times, the rise of Athens created fear in Sparta, leading to conflict. This idea, often described as a security dilemma, suggests that nations driven by fear and the pursuit of security inevitably find themselves in competition and conflict. This dynamic continues to shape global politics, where mistrust and power struggles dominate relations between nations. Victory or defeat depends on your strength. Ultimately, power is what matters. This realist perspective influenced the way nations operated during this period, and naturally, it also shaped the ideas of scholars of the time. Machiavelli's concept of dual morality is a prime example. He argued that rulers cannot apply the same moral principles as ordinary people. For the sake of the nation's security and benefit, a ruler's morality must differ. If ensuring the country's safety requires difficult decisions, such as taking lives, those actions are justified. A ruler cannot afford to view such acts through the lens of everyday morality. For the common man, however, these actions should still be viewed as wrong, as this distinction between morality creates stability. But the morality of a ruler and that of the common man must not align because their responsibilities are fundamentally different. Unfortunately, Machiavelli's ideas are often misused today. He advocated dual morality strictly in the context of national interest. Yet, modern politicians sometimes exploit this concept for their personal agendas. Now, let's return to the story of the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson proposed this idea after World War I as a solution to the recurring problem of insecurity among nations. Wars were fueled by each country's fear for its security, leading to arms races and conflicts. Wilson's concept aimed to address this through collective security. The idea was simple. Instead of each nation focusing solely on its own security, an international organization called the League of Nations would take on this role. Every country would become a member, and the League would collectively ensure security for all, thereby preventing future wars. Let me explain this a little further. For those watching this discussion, imagine this. The League of Nations was envisioned as a unified organization where all nations would collaborate to resolve security concerns collectively, reducing the need for individual nations to build up weapons or act unilaterally. This was the foundation of Wilson's vision. The goal of this platform is to establish global security. While some doubted its feasibility, others believed in its potential. The fundamental premise of the League of Nations was cooperation, challenging the realist notion that humans are inherently conflict-prone, cowardly, fickle-minded, deceitful, and ungrateful. Realists emphasize these traits, while liberals argue that humans can recognize mutual benefits in cooperation. Liberals believe that collaboration rather than conflict leads to shared gains and lasting peace. The idea of the League of Nations was proposed by Woodrow Wilson, but the US Senate refused the necessary support, leaving its implementation to Britain and France. However, both nations hesitated to invest resources, especially as the interwar period between 1919 and 1939 saw the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany. Fascism, deriving from the symbol of a bundle of sticks, emphasized unity and state supremacy. Leaders like Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany promoted the idea that the state's strength depends on collective unity, asserting nothing before, against, or above the state. These ideologies gave rulers immense power, suppressing dissent in the name of national unity. Britain and France viewed fascism as a counterforce to communism, considering it an ally against their ideological adversary. They underestimated fascism's threat, allowing it to gain strength. This miscalculation culminated in World War II between 1939 and 1945, where capitalist and communist nations like the USA, USSR, Britain, and France united against fascist powers like Germany, Italy, and Japan. Post World War II, the League of Nations was replaced by the United Nations, grounded in the principle of collective security. Unlike collective defense, example NATO, which targets specific threats, collective security ensures global peace by uniting nations against any aggressor. The United Nations became the arbiter of state legitimacy, granting or denying recognition to entities like Taiwan and Palestine. During the Cold War between 1945 and 1991, realism resurfaced, urging nations like the United States to maintain global dominance. Scholars like Morgenthau emphasized power politics, advocating for the US to shape a global order that ensured its hegemony. This led to doctrines like Truman's interventionist approach and the Marshall Plan, which provided economic aid to Europe in exchange for market access and influence. Hegemonic stability theory justified the United States' dominance, claiming that a single global superpower ensures predictability and order. The democratic peace theory proposed by Michael Doyle argued that democracies are less likely to wage wars. This rationale underpinned the United States' interventions in the Middle East, ostensibly promoting democracy, but also securing strategic and economic interests. Geopolitical concepts continue to evolve. The Indo-Pacific framework has replaced the Asia-Pacific focus, reflecting efforts by nations like the United States, India, and Japan to counterbalance China's growing influence. Such alliances shape the global order, fostering economic opportunities and determining the contours of international politics. This brings us to the end of the video in this two-part series. Please put your suggestions in the comments box. Thank you so much for watching. We hope that you have liked this video. We will see you next time.